Welcome to our first Wednesdays of the season. We're very excited to have Michele Barale, Barale here tonight, talking about Willa Cather's Prairie landscapes. I just want to tell you a couple other things coming up soon. Next Wednesday, October 9th, we have a special presentation from Dwayne Leffel, who wrote the book Kicking Gas and Taking Charge, about a cross-country tour he took with an electronic vehicle before charging stations were really a thing. With I think 4 other vehicles. So he should be very interesting. And then the next first Wednesday, which will be November, I think it's November 2nd. You'll have to check. November 6th, thank you. I forgot to put that on there. We'll be with Dartmouth professor Richard Wright, discussing the racially fragmented city, emerging patterns of diversity and segregation on national, state, and local levels. Very topical. I'm going to introduce Christine Hadsell, who is on our Athenaeum board, and she's also on the board of the Vermont Humanities Council. Christine?
Yes, I get to wear 2 hats tonight. So my job, or what I would like to do, is just introduce Michele. She is an emeritus professor at Amherst College, where she's been a professor of sexuality, women's and gender studies, and the director of the Writing Center. She received her PhD from the University of Colorado, and she has a long-time interest in Willa Cather, her writings, and her photography. Her recent publications on Cather have been focused on her attitudes about artistic inspiration, and she has taught about Willa Cather for the past 30 years. So we welcome her, and I gather that some of her inspiration has to do with landscapes and landscape painting. So we took her down and gave her a quick little tour of our own collection of landscape painting, which is different genre, but still Willa Cather would have been very familiar with the kind of thing that is down in our own gallery. So thank you all for coming, and the Humanities Council is very pleased to have the Athenaeum as one of its sites. It will always have the Athenaeum as one of its sites. Over my dead body, it will not change. And it's very nice to see so many of you here tonight. So thank you.
Lost my microphone. And just before I step on it, it's right there. You're trailing it. I trailed it. My mom said there'd be days like this. I'd say be this one. Now I just have to figure out. Got it. Hello. I'm delighted to be here. And I have to say, I was just saying to others that one of the delights of being on this circuit for the Vermont Humanities Council is that I got to see Vermont, and I got to see its libraries. This is the best I've seen, I have to tell you in all honesty. Okay, that this library is a real stunner, and that having the Bierstadt is a nice thing to go with it. I'm going to talk about Cather. I'm probably going to walk around a lot. If you can't hear me, let me know. I can have a big booming voice because I'm used to talking in big classrooms. So if I'm too loud, let me know. If I'm too soft, let me know. Cather was born in 1873 or 1875 or 1876. It depended on when you asked her. As she aged, she changed years. And I'm kind of sympathetic to this one. She probably was born in 1873 in Virginia, not Nebraska. And her parents moved to Nebraska when she was 9 or 10, or if you go by other dates, 3 or 4. It's interesting to me, she was born in 73, which would make it 8 years after the Civil War. And she died in 47, which would have been 6 years after Pearl Harbor. So 2 huge wars kind of bracket her. But then there's other things going on as well. I mean, if we think of the Civil War, we think of a very different Victorian America. We think of World War II, and we think of a very modern America. At the same time, because she's living where she's living, Nebraska, and the plains and the West, 2 other incidents happen that I think are very formative, though you don't quite see them in the literature. One is that the year of her birth is also the year of Custer's last stand. And when she's 20, Geronimo finally surrenders to the United States government. So there is this other peoples in America, and she is aware of it. And if you read Death Comes for the Archbishop, you'll find the largest sense of her as recognizing that there is a group of Americans who she in fact hasn't really written about until that moment. But there's also a way in which she's very aware of who isn't in her novels. That's not what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be talking about the Prairies. And I'm going to look at 3 novels in particular, probably with more emphasis on My Antonia, because to me it concludes the Prairie novels. But they begin with O Pioneers, 1913. They go on to Song of the Lark, 1915, and then My Antonia, 1918. The woman wrote a lot, 12 novels. She never stopped writing. She started writing in college for the Lincoln papers, and she just continued until the day she died, quite literally. So she herself said, well, Oh Pioneers, it wasn't tough to write. I just sat down and did it. Song of the Lark, her publishers felt, yeah, you should have sat down and edited it too, because it was 3 times as long as O Pioneers. And when she got to My Antonia, which is sort of in the middle in terms of size, I feel like she sensed she got it right. She fiddled with it a little, and maybe in some interesting ways, or maybe not. Ask me a different year and I'll say, oh, it was fascinating. Ask me this year and I think, not so much. But those 3 novels together give us such a strong sense of her own development of thought about the meaning of the prairie and about the meaning of landscape for her. And I'll just say off the top that for my way of reading Cather, landscape or nature or even the emptiness of prairie or canyon is absolutely central to herself as an artist and central to her understanding of what goes to inspire art. It's not that she is fuzzy-minded about nature, and I'll make that pretty clear as I start talking about the novels, but that she sees in nature something, and I don't know that I can put a word to it, that has to do with grandness, with monumentality, as in Bierstadt, with hugeness and emptiness that's necessary for any kind of creative impulse to sort of come into production. When O Pioneers opens, we see a prairie landscape in which there are a couple of houses kind of almost not sitting. They're being blown left and right by the wind. There are just a few stores and a little girl, and mainly we start with a little boy named Emil, whose cat has climbed a lamppost and he cannot get her down. And he talks to his friend, Carl, who is there, and Carl is kind of a lame brain about it. I don't know. And in strides somebody who's described as looking very much like a soldier, and that's Alexandra Bergson, who is the heroine of O Pioneers. And Alexandra is going to get the kitten, and she manages to. So we bring the endangered kitten down. The three still young kids, really, Alexandra is 14, get into the wagon and they head off into the dark. And as they move away from whatever habitation there is in Hanover, Nebraska, there's a lantern that they try to light to keep on the wagon so they can sort of see their way. And Carl gets off and he goes home. And it's just Alexandra and this little boy and the kitten headed into the dark. And the first chapter, next chapter, 6 years later. So we see these very vulnerable children heading into the dark emptiness with just a small lantern to give them any light. When Song of the Lark opens, it's a completely different opening, except maybe it's not. We open in a doctor's office, Dr. Archie, who's being petitioned by a father to come and see his wife who's about to give birth. And Dr. Archie sort of thinks, well, Mrs. Kronberg is really pretty capable. She's done this a number of times, but okay, I'm gonna go. And as he's attending to Mrs. Kronberg, he hears a child coughing and coughing and coughing. And it's such a deep cough and such a terrible wheeze that he goes to see the child after the birth and thinks, the father was crazy. The wife is perfectly capable of everything. This child is very sick. So he tends to the child, and he starts coming back to see the child, who clearly, he says, has influenza, whatever that might mean, and it needs to be seen to. And that child is, of course, Thea Kronberg, whose chest has been bothering her, whose lungs have been filled with fluid, and who now is going to become a pretty healthy young woman. But again, we've got a child at risk. The Prairie in that novel hasn't happened yet. We start in a very civilized place, a doctor's office. But we start, again, with something vulnerable, endangered. Switch now to my Antonia. 1913, 1915, and now 1918. And my Antonia opens in a very, I want to say, almost confusing way. This is the year when I don't think it's terribly important, but last year I did. It opens with an introduction in which somebody says, well, I've been riding on a train through the West, and it's hot and it's dusty, and by gosh, I ran into an old friend of mine, Jim, and Jim and I talked about the West and how we'd grown up here. And Jim says he's been thinking a lot about Antonia, who we both knew. And he's thinking of writing about her, and I invited him to do so. In the initial edition of that book in 1918, whoever that speaker is in the introduction, I was riding on the train, is unidentified. We know absolutely nothing. In the 1927 edition, when she had to do some editing, that figure is given a gender, a female. But again, we don't know a name, we know absolutely nothing, and we will not hear from that figure again, except to find one thing in this introduction. The last paragraph tells us that some years later, Jim shows up at her front door and says, listen, I did it, I wrote about Antonia, remember that? And hands me a manuscript, looks at it for a moment, and then scrolls "my" before Antonia, as if taking at that moment responsibility for the narrative as his narrative of her, not the narrative of Antonia. And now that prologue, that introduction is over, and the novel itself begins. And it begins with Jim, the guy who wrote My Antonia. And he's on a train, his grandparents, his parents have died, he's being sent to live with his grandparents. And he's very excited about going west from Virginia. And he's reading a novel called The Life of Jesse James. And it is the most exciting thing he has ever read in his life. And he can hardly wait to get to where he's going because he knows life is going to be as exciting as that novel. You're not high school or college students, you know life is not going to be as exciting as the life of Jesse James. He's going to a farm in Nebraska, for goodness sake. And whatever that narrative of Jesse James is, it may or it may not be as truthful as the narrative of Athenaeum. It may be just as romanticized or just as filled with a combination of truth, personal experience, and sheer fabrication for whatever reasons. We'll never know. Riding that train with Jim is an immigrant family. They are Bohemians, which probably at that point means Czechoslovakia, but I can't find out for certain. And they too are moving to the West, and they have a daughter about Jim's age, so the conductor teases him, and Jim is having none of this teasing, and he just sticks to his novel. They reach Red Cloud, where he's going to meet his grandparents. And onto the train to get him come two guys straight out of The Life of Jesse James. One has a big mustache, they're both wearing boots, they've got hats on, they've got big belts, and he's agog. They take him outside. He sees the immigrant family going off. He doesn't want anything to do with him. This is his adventure. And put him in a wagon in back. And they wrap him in a blanket and set him among the hay. And he bounces away for the next several hours as they head to the grandparents' farm. And as he bounces, he looks up at the sky and he thinks, I don't know those stars. I'm in a different place. And he looks around and there are no lights. He can barely see the people in front of him who are running the wagon. And he thinks, I'm nowhere. It's so black, I can't see anything human or civilized anymore. It's like he fell off the face of the world. And he thinks, there are no rules here. There is no God. There is nothing. And he is terrified. He kind of makes his peace with it because he starts getting drowsy, but he knows he is nowhere now. When he wakes up, he's in a bed in his grandparents' house. Behind him, there is a round window with the light streaming through it. His grandmother is at the foot of the bed. She's touching him and she says, she's crying. She says, you look so like your father in this room. It could have been him. Get dressed, come downstairs and get washed up. So he leaves the room with the white window, goes down the stairs into the basement where they cook, and he starts washing up. His grandmother says, now be sure and wash well. Do you need me to help you behind your ear? No, he says, I can wash myself. And the grandmother says, okay, and feeds him, and then she says, we're gonna go out. I need to do some hoeing in the garden patch. Now be careful. There are snakes out there, big snakes, so watch your step. They go out to the pumpkin patch. And I don't want to say it any more bluntly than this. Jim has gone into a land without rules, without God, with only darkness. He has just been born into the light and baptized in his grandmother's house. And now he goes out to the pumpkin patch, being careful of snakes. Does this sound familiar? Yeah, it sounds familiar. We think we've heard this story. And he watches his grandmother hoeing, and pumpkins, and this is very surreal, the pumpkins seem like they fill the whole space. And he sits down and he leans back against a pumpkin,
And he thinks, this is what it would be like to die. This is what it would be like to just meld into the earth, to be a pumpkin. And he's very comforted. And I've just given you sort of the full circle of what Cather is going to do, certainly in the Prairie novels. That there is danger, and she resolves it in O Pioneers by bringing the child through danger into light and birth and cleanliness, and then into a kind of tranquility with mortality. So that if the child begins in terror, the kitten's up there, it's dark out there. My Antonia solves that problem. What solves the terror of the darkness is nature, is a pumpkin, is not grandmother so much or a human being so much as the inanimate, organic thing. But in all three novels, I'm going to argue, the Prairie has two sides to it. Mostly, the Prairie is emptiness. I was kind of chuckling to myself. My partner pointed out, she said, now there's a picture that'd make you want to visit, huh? Right, there's nothing there. And it's true. I mean, I've seen this picture in color, and it's brown and beige and gray. And there's a little bit of kind of a pale yellow, and then it's brown and beige and brown. It's not color that makes a prairie, it's movement. It's what Cather in O Pioneers calls in Song of the Lark calls the sea of grass. So that it becomes, the prairie becomes, I want to say, what the ocean is. And ultimately what she will say is, this emptiness that is prairie is not a nation, is not a civilization, is not a town. It's the stuff from which those things get made. And so in Pioneers, we see it get made into something. In Song of the Lark, we see it get made into voice. I'm going to try this again. We see it get made into voice. We see it get made into art. And then in My Antonia, that prairie gets made into fertile farm. It gets made into citizens. It gets made into the kind of art that a woman who, Antonia, who cannot read, who does not write, who doesn't really even speak English much anymore. She's married another bohemian. That this woman produces from her body, and that's this, at the end of the novel, this explosion of children from a fruit cellar in the ground. They just come running up, one after the other, joyful and dancing with glee, impish. And that Jim realizes, they're both old now, this he realizes is the art that Antonia takes from the prairie land. It's not the fruit, it's not the farm produce, though they certainly got that. It is, if you will, citizenships, little bodies to fill the earth. I don't think I'm going too far to say that Cather uses My Antonia to kind of round out her sense of nature. But I do think that if I only looked at My Antonia, I would miss some of the more complicated things that nice rounding sort of doesn't let you think about. So now I'm going to go back 2 steps to Song of the Lark. the novel written just before My Antonia in 1915, and the novel which her editors felt, and many, many critics felt, was, oh my God, way too long, please cut something. What's interesting is that novel starts in Nebraska, but actually she calls it Colorado, but the town is an exact replica of her own childhood town, an exact replica. I can plot it out on a picture of Red Cloud where she was born and her description of Moonstone, just one-to-one. But so it starts there in a little tiny dusty prairie town, but it ends in New York, where, gosh, Cather ended. She left Nebraska, got a job in Pittsburgh, got a job in New York, and never left it. Which is not to say she didn't go back all the time. She traveled incessantly and heavily in the West. But that the arc of her life, like the arc of Thea Kronberg's in Song of the Lark, is from prairie to big urban center. What's interesting about Song of the Lark is that it's a novel, and it's one of Cather's earliest novels, that makes the main character an artist and makes it a female artist. She writes a lot about artists, and she will in her later stuff. But this is the first time where I think we've got a concentrated vision of the artist, and it's one of the few where the artist is a woman. Never a writer for Cather. It's always something else. And here it's voice. And Cather had been an opera reviewer early in her life, and she loved opera to the very end. So I guess it's not too surprising that Thea comes to art. What is interesting is where Thea gets her inspiration for voice. Thea has been struggling to be a concert pianist, and she just can't, her heart somehow isn't in it. That's why she moved to New York. That's what she's trying to become. She works and works and works at it, and it's just not going anywhere. And she makes money for herself by singing in church choirs around town, where they pay her to sing important parts. And one of her piano teachers hears her and says, you ever try singing anything better than that? And she says, no, this is how I make my living. He says, well, I'd like you to sing for, and he names somebody, and she sings for him. The guy says, oh my Lord, where have you been all my life? And so she now turns away from something she tried so hard at and failed to something that she rather quickly learns she's very good at and that she loves. But what she doesn't love is the life that accompanies being a professional musician. She finds it, she's still a good, I want to say, farm girl. She finds it fake. She finds it money-focused. She doesn't like the way in which people who aren't very talented get great reviews because they know the right people. She just finds it phony. And in a moment of depression, she goes off and ends up in Mesa Verde in Colorado. Mesa Verde being all the pueblos. And she literally camps there. She sleeps in one of the old stone houses. She bathes in the river. She brings her water up in a big jar. And one day she's bringing the water up in one of these urns. She looks around and she sees broken pieces of pottery everywhere. And she thinks, you know, somebody smart thought about making pots to bring water up. They probably didn't start there, but it's a long walk down, and if you bring up a big pot of water, you don't have to go down again for the day. Some smart woman realized that if you make this round thing with a spout, you can bring the water up and you can easily pour it. And she starts thinking about water moving from the river into a handmade object and coming up its throat. And she begins to realize that that's what she needs to do for herself, to understand that what is coming up for her as voice, in fact, is coming from some deep river of nature, not from something artificial and not from something that she synthesizes from things around her, but from something she doesn't even really understand how she's part of, but is. So it's at that moment when she turns not to prairie so much as to empty space. Once human-made, but now not so much. It's been uninhabited for 1,000 years. It is in that moment that she understands, though I can say it no better than Cather said it, that the nature of her artistry is to bring the water up through the throat of the vessel, and she is the vessel. And from that, she goes back to New York, and she kind of cuts through all the nonsense, goes off to Europe, becomes a big name, comes back to New York, and the old Dr. Archie, who patted her back and made sure she didn't die from bronchitis or influenza, he's there to see her great opening. And he's pretty pleased with himself. And she comes out of her dressing room after the opera singing something Wagnerian. She's a big woman. She's not going to sing anything small and delicate in French. And he realizes that the face off stage, the face no longer performing its art, is the face of an aging and haggard woman who's tired. And that what gives her life and energy and support is the art itself. She doesn't support it, it vitalizes her. And when she's done with it, he says, it's taken its toll of her. It's a tremendous task. And that's sort of where we end. Dr. Archie has become somebody kind of devil may care. He didn't like his wife anyway, and neither did we. And it seems pretty clear that Taya's not going to take up with a man who we think she probably shouldn't take up with, even though we wish she would, but nah, he's married, and don't do it. And so we're left really with no romances that are the resolution of their lives. I want to say Taya is the person in front of us, and the resolution to her life is art. And away from it, she's an old, tired, worn woman. So you can have your art, but it's not going to save you. Jim at least had that pumpkin, I want to say, but that was about dying. If we go one more step back to O Pioneers, the very first novel that sort of got her on the books, not her first novel, her second, and her third major publication, the first being a book of really dreadful poems, which I can't beg you enough not to read because you'll hate her. It's like the bad paintings downstairs as opposed to the good paintings. What time should I stop?
No rush.
Don't hurry.
Okay, this is about 7 minutes, I think. In O Pioneers, the conclusion is, again, not a happy one. It's not going to be an easy ending for us. Taya Kronberg, Alexandra Bergson of O Pioneers is like Taya, kind of larger than life. She runs the farms. She tells her brothers what to do. She was smart enough to know that in the midst of a drought, what you do is you buy more farms because everybody's going back east. You don't give up. You keep going. Why you keep going? Because the divide, which is the high plains where she is doing her farming, because the divide for her is her. It's grass, it's chirping crickets. Catherine must like crickets, they show up a lot. It's winds, it's rough earth. All of this, Alexandra thinks to herself, is what, not who she is, it's what she is. That this is the heart of her. She's not going to leave it, buy more land. And she's smart enough to know that you don't fight the land, you figure out what the land needs, and then you give it to it. So she ends up having the best farms in the county because she, I suppose today we would say, she knew something about agricultural science. Her brothers fight with the land, and they don't get so far. But Alexandra, at one point, recognizes that she's deeply lonely. And Carl, who has been away, comes back. And she's very pleased that finally she has someone. And she has a recurring dream. And the dream is an odd one, and it makes my students giggle at best and kind of groan at worst. In this dream, and she is a big woman, she's a massive woman, she's tall, she's wide, she's blonde, she's got strong arms. That enough makes my students giggle. But in the dream, somebody comes to her. He is a kind of corn god. And he picks her up. And she realizes that he is so strong that she is light as a feather. And he carries her away. And when she wakes from that dream, she has a moment of pleasure, and then she feels totally guilty, and she runs and she has this dream often. She takes an ice-cold bath and punishes herself for it. And my students think, oh, this is really, adult sexuality is so embarrassing. But I think it's a little more complicated than that. She is the earth. Who else would she mate with if not a corn god? Who else would be strong enough to lift her and carry her? Alexandra, who carries everyone else, is aging. She's in her 40s by this point, and recognizes that she needs to be carried too. And so she and Carl, who continues to be a skinny guy who succeeds at nothing, and he tries 7 different things, and he's a failure at all of them, she and Carl will marry. End of story. They are not lovers, they are the best of friends. And of course, at this point, my students are banging their heads against the wall. They thought they were going to get romance, and what do they get? Friendship. Well, okay. But there's one more little flip I have to throw in here. So Alexandra stays on the prairie. She is the prairie. She mates with the prairie. But she has a younger brother, Emil, the guy who lost his kitten, who's enamored of a young bohemian woman named Maria Shabata. Maria has married a very bad man. He's abusive. He drinks, and he's wildly jealous. And Maria's being a good girl, but Emil can barely control himself. He is so in love with Marie. Emil is clearly his sister's child. He's young. She got that kitten down for him. She had hoped he would go to university. He did, that he would come back. He has, that he wouldn't just live a life like his other brothers, that he would clearly be the guy who could take charge of the farm. But Emil can't get his mind off of Marie. He one day goes to scythe, so he's cutting the grasses of the prairie, and where those grasses are, she said, knocking over the stuff, frog. Those grasses that he's cutting so carefully with the scythe are in a cemetery. He's cutting the grass in the old Norwegian cemetery. And Maria sees him, and she just she goes to him and talks to him, and it's all over. They start embracing, and Maria's husband is watching. He watches for a while, and you know what that scythe can do to flesh. He kills both of them. So, if in fact the end of the novel is that Alexandra and Carl will come together, but their physical union will not produce children. They're both, she in particular is too old by this point. Her children are her fields. The more normal pairing of Carl, of Emil and Maria comes to a terrible end. And Alexandra never recovers from that. The husband who was killed, the two goes to jail. Alexandra goes to meet them, goes to see him. She feels terrible for him. She thinks he could barely control himself. And I'm reading it and thinking, well, surely he can control himself a little. But we get the two dead, beautiful bodies in the grass. And I want to say there is no human fruition except that of the prairie ground in this novel. And I've sort of purposely gone backwards because my Antonia ends with those children erupting from the fruit cellar. And O Pioneers ends with a husband killer in jail and a union between two people who will produce no children. And I think she had to work that out. She can't work it out in any way that is erotically satisfying, I want to say, for 20-year-olds. She can't do that. It's too complicated. And certainly to work it out that the fruition of the prairie is voice, is art. That doesn't satisfy either. But I think that's what she's working for. How I know the prairie is this great energy producer. Now, what does it produce? Well, okay, farms. What does it produce? Art. What does it produce? Children. How can I make those children happen? Watch. And so that's how I see an arc happening, from death to life, with art in the middle. That's sort of my shtick. So if you have questions, I would be happy to answer them. Or I can give you a quiz. All right, take out your pencils. Yeah.
Did she talk about, she talks about the grandeur of the plains. Did she talk about how it just destroyed them?
Did Cather talk about the grandeur of the plains and talk about how they were destroyed? No, she does not. It is interesting that, and I think this explains why she doesn't, those novels are so retrospective. They're always, one critic says, these are novels of mourning, mourning, that what Cather is doing in these novels is grieving for a past that she can't find again. So she is not going to go. She does go there one moment, and that's in O Pioneers, when Alexandra looks around and realizes that her brother's wives have all gone kind of furniture crazy and are wearing too many clothes, and they're moving away from the farm. But I personally don't think that Cather works well for those who are doing environmental criticism. She's just not in the present. She's only in the past. So, and when she leaves the past and goes to the present, it's New York, or it's Santa Fe, or it's Quebec. But no, she does not. It's an interesting problem.
So she didn't address issues where people just work themselves to death and got sick and got injured.
She does. does she show us the realities of what it takes, of the labor it takes to make something? She does in terms of, and I didn't even go there, Antonia, who practically works herself into being nothing more than bone and muscle. Her father, who commits suicide because he cannot stand what he's in, the lack of civilization and art. Her mother, who becomes grasping and miserable. She does it there. I don't want to say Cather romanticizes farming or the plains. I think it's more complicated than that because she's using it for this other purpose, and that purpose is to figure something out. And I do see all of the novels, all 12 of them, as working out something. And the same is true with the short stories. So Cather knows of the labor, and I haven't even talked about immigrants and what is so revolutionary about Cather's pioneers is that most of them don't speak English. And that's an interesting problem to talk about today. It certainly was noticed when she wrote the novels. Nobody had shown America being made by people who weren't American. But that's exactly who she has making the plains. Yeah.
Does she ever write about the Dust Bowl, about the dust storms?
She does not. She is so...
Grown up with them, though.
She must have.
Yeah.
And, she was a newspaper woman. She read what was going on, but no, she is focused on her little bit of Nebraska. And she doesn't, when she leaves the Prairie, she talks about New York. But when she's looking at the Prairie, it's just that. It is the high plains and not much else. I mean, the Mesa Verde is as great a difference from the plains as she can go when we're still out in the West. We certainly don't get at California and citrus groves. And she's just not interested. It's a very myopic kind of a vision. And that's part of why I think she is trying so hard to work out some problem for herself. I don't pretend to know what that problem is. And I don't mean it in a psychopathological way. I mean it in kind of a critical art way, that she's trying to understand. Here she is, the first of 7 children, of a mother and father, a father who was a lovely father, but never made much money, and a mother who was clearly done to death by all these children in a 3-bedroom house, and was not particularly pleased with the kinds of housekeeping that a new place in Nebraska called for, as opposed to a well-established farm in Virginia where she was born and raised and lived the first part of her married life. How did she come to be who she was? I think that bothered her a lot. And I don't think she could, I think all her life she spent trying to figure out, where'd the art come from? What is this about? How did I get here? Why am I doing this? The rest of my family work on railroads, but they don't read much. So she is an anomaly, and I think that anomaly, that anomalous position bothered her a lot all her life. She was also very, very snobbish. Not about status, but about being an artist. It was all that mattered. All that mattered. Yes?
You mentioned at the beginning of your talk these 2 significant events involving Native Americans, Cusco-Pastan and Geronimo surrendering, but then you haven't mentioned Native Americans since then.
And they're not in any of those 3 novels.
Why are those significant events in the class?
Where I see, I'm not sure why they're lacking there except for this extraordinary myopia, though I would say that Song of the Lark and I just didn't bring this in because I was going somewhere else, but one of the great influences for Thea Kronberg's art is a man named Spanish Johnny, who is, she says, a natural-born singer. No training whatsoever, but he sings at night. And the people in the white part of town like to hear him, but they don't like to know who's making that lovely sound. And he goes on benders. He goes off for a month at a time, gets himself sick, drunk, comes back, his wife takes care of him, he gets better, he sings, everybody's happy, he goes off on another drunk. And she goes to hear Spanish Johnny, and her mother is not happy about it. Because people are going to be talking. You don't belong there. And what Cather makes happen is that is that Spanish Johnny and his wife become figures out of classics. So they become, I want to say, old European figures. She sits at the window and brushes her hair and weeps for him. And he goes away and has disappeared, and then he comes back and she nurses him, and then he goes out and sings and he makes this beautiful music. And that's where Thea first learns something about voice as natural. That's as close as we're going to get to Native Americans in those three novels. Spanish Johnny. They do show up elsewhere. A Lost Lady, which is a marvelous novel, and one of the Prairie novels. I would argue with all my teeth that Cather is only too aware that the story she is not telling us is the story of where all that land came from, how those bankers got that land, where did that ranch land begin, who really didn't have any fences at all. They're not mentioning it, and she doesn't either, but I swear to God, she keeps drawing your attention to, wasn't their land to begin with? No. How'd they get that land? Well, they didn't buy it, I can assure you. So she's up to something there. And then I think Death Comes for the Archbishop has a number of Native Americans in it. And there, as with Spanish Johnny, the Native American is, and I differ from a lot of critics on this one, the Native American is for her and for the priest in it. The person who brings beauty in a natural, unforced, absolutely artistic way into the landscape. What she has the priest realize is that these Navajo, they see the land and they work within the land because they see it's beautiful in a way we can't. And I don't think it's condescending at all. It's something the priest can't quite figure out. What is it they see? Because at the end of the novel, and I think Cather is not so pleased with this, but that's not the way we usually read it. At the end of the novel, the priest is going to build this great cathedral. The problem is, and Cather says, it was a French cathedral in the middle of New Mexico. Huh? The whole novel has been valorizing the natural landscape and the ways in which the peoples of that landscape do not interfere with it. And so here comes the priest, and what does he do? He brings Europe big into that landscape. I don't think we're supposed to think that was only good. I think we're supposed to be very divided. Yes, it's a beautiful thing. Not here. The Indians are dying out in that novel, and she's very aware of it. The priest isn't helping. He's afraid of them. So it's an interesting novel for me in terms of Native peoples because she doesn't let us move comfortably in any direction. And that to me is why she's so interesting and why she's the right thing for adults to read. I'm sorry, I'm still back there arguing with 20-year-olds. Thank you very much for a lovely evening. You've been great listening to me. And I appreciate it.